Welcome to this fifth session. I think we've had about 320 people attend these sessions now, which is far bigger than we ever talked about. We wanted it to be a little community, but everybody's been so passionate and it's fantastic. As usual, I'd like to start by acknowledging this Guringai land and the traditional owners of the Guringai land that I'm talking from, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Last week's poll, as we ended last week's session, we went back to the original session where we'd been talking about the burning issues that people had and were keeping them up at night. And Sam shared lots of hers with us. But other ones came up as well. And in particular, we grouped up the ones from all the chats over the previous weeks and let people vote if you weren't here. And overwhelmingly, people wanted to talk about the brand or image issue of careers education. So not having all the answers, obviously, we decided that an interactive session where we actually gather people's perceptions of that and real lived experiences of that would be the best way to approach that. We also did a Google survey about the format of these sessions, and people wanted more interactivity. So we've introduced obviously the after party. So stick around for the 15-minute informal chat at the end, which has been lovely to get to know people a bit better. But we're also this week having breakout rooms. So we'll have an initial setup of what the issue might be and how we're going to frame the discussion. And we will introduce our panelists who are kindly facilitating the breakout rooms as well. Then we're going to break up into these separate rooms for 15 minutes and really dive into some of those issues so we can hear diverse experiences and insights from everybody about this before coming back together. And then we'll decide where next based on what the answers are and what the feeling is. So I'm just going to share this. In terms of framing this discussion, we did call it a brand issue when we were talking about it last week. But actually, when we were thinking about it, it's, careers education in itself is not a brand. So we really need to look at it as an image problem. And, what has come up in the last few weeks is, should we call it careers? Should we call it life design? I think the biggest question we have to ask is there an overarching image problem first, so that we know where the root of this is. And I was trying to come up with an analogy for kind of a similar field that's had a similar experience that we might use as a framework to look back on, and it might help keep us on track. The only one I could really come up with that was similar, who's gone through a kind of transformation of image, and I'm sure there are lots more, was yoga. So, if we look 10 years ago, yoga was really perceived as alternative, maybe 20 years ago, was very perceived as alternative. And, some generations like my dad, when I started doing yoga, he's, you're into Buddhism now, you're going to move to India. And there was that perception of this is alternative, it's only for certain niche groups. And although they didn't change the name of yoga, the increase of the way people understood it and the evidence behind it and the benefits and the way people experienced it and all of its different facets and niches has really transformed into such a state that you'll see on the right, all those images of where yoga and mindfulness is experienced as mainstream now. So it wasn't so much a rebrand, but it was a new way of experiencing it and understanding it. So I think when we're looking at careers and potentially career development broader than careers education, but for today we're looking at careers education in schools. We really need to look at that, not just in terms of what it's called, but the perception and the image of it and how it's lived and experienced by people. Hopefully that's going to be useful to keep us on track and kind of keep our perspective and be able to come back to where we are as a field as against something like this afterwards when we've had the discussions. So just to introduce our amazing panel joining us and facilitating today, I'm going to go back to this one so it's not distracting. Obviously, we've got Professor Jim Bright joining us every week. Jim is on day 4 of a fast, so a bit hangry. Pat O'Reilly, Head of Pathways and Partnerships at Sydney Catholic Schools. He contributed a lot last week, so he got the tap on the shoulder to please come and join us on the panel list and facilitate this week. So thank you for joining us. Liz Jackson experienced educator, now doing her PhD, focusing on soft skills analysis in the K-12 sector, including entrepreneurship and touching on this careers space as well. So really interesting insights there. Hi, Liz, give us a wave, Liz. And Sam McFetridge, back instrumental in setting up these sessions from the beginning. So thank you for coming back to us, Sam.
Welcome.
So we are not aiming to solve the issue today, but what we really want to do is just explore it. Is there an issue? So when we were talking throughout these weeks, hold on, I'm just going to stop sharing this so you can see people. I lost all my Zoom people. There were two main things that came up when we were talking about brand. The first issue was that someone raised that she was writing a new strategy for a whole system approach, not a whole school approach, a whole system approach to student futures. And she was really reluctant, this stretch from K to 12, and she was really reluctant to call it careers education because she thought it just wouldn't get the profile and value and resources that it deserved, and people wouldn't even raise their head to listen to it if it was called careers education. Sam, I'll come to you first. Is that something you hear from people in your network in careers functions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much variation across the board in terms of the consistency of how it's actually delivered, which I think sometimes may work to our disadvantage. You know, I'm really fortunate that I have an amazing head of school, a principal that highly values career education, but I know some of my colleagues, you know, don't necessarily get that support or that image there because of the value. So I think there are huge inconsistencies across the board, and until we have that consistent where it is at the forefront, I think we're still going to experience that. So we're at a time where we can really reshape, reinvent, and put careers education, or that word or that concept of where it should be, right at the forefront, and embed that in everything that we're doing within our schools. So yeah, absolutely, so much variation and big inconsistencies, I think, across the board.
So does that mean that actually those inconsistencies are driven by the perception rather than people not understanding the value of what someone's doing? They're actually prevented from creating the value they should be because of the perception?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also comes from understanding as well, in that lack of understanding of what it is and how it has evolved significantly. You know, I was talking on a couple of parent panels this week, and we often have that assumption of what we think people should know. And I think we need to go back to those core basics and actually understand, well, you know, people may be coming in with different perceptions on how it is viewed. And I think until we try and understand where they're coming from on those angles, with that perception and what it looks like, we're not going to be able to do anything into that space. So I think it's part of it is awareness, but I also think understanding, and that's where we're in a very powerful position as well, because being advocates in this space and actually getting out there and promoting change, I think we have a huge responsibility, especially to all our colleagues as well, of getting out there and making some noise, and doing things differently. And yeah, I suppose it's the ripple effects. So those small changes that we make, what are the ripple effects that we're going to see, you know, 2 to 3 years time, you know, in that space, so that we can make careers education right at the front where it belongs.
So the people that do have supportive execs and the buy-in need to kind of reach back round and share the stories of best practice and be responsible for raising the bar generally.
Absolutely, absolutely. And bringing your colleagues on board with you. And I know within my environments, it's not a competitive, and I'm talking about external to my school environments as well. It's actually not a competitive. We're all trying to do the same things. We're trying to bring the students along. So it's not that competitive nature. It's that collegial, it's sharing, and it's actually bringing people on board along with you as you do that. And I think the more momentum we get and that more cultural change that we see around this space, I think that is going to really push us forward into the future. So it's that, I think it's an awareness thing. I think it is a perception thing, but I think we also have an incredible responsibility to make sure that we get out there and we communicate that message so that it is at the forefront of where it should be.
Awesome. Okay, that is an amazing start. The second issue that came up was a disconnect, which is kind of related now that you've talked about the exec and buy-in. Someone was thinking about school brands and how a brand of a school relates to the brand of careers education. And Liz, I know your PhD work is giving you deep insights into this kind of disconnect between what a school says and what a school does. How does that play out in the careers space, do you think?
Hi everybody. So I think from my perspective, coming from education, now moving into working for a startup and working in the business side of it, and now working with schools again, I come from a very unique perspective where you look at the traditional career definition of what a career means, and it looks at an occupation undertaken from a person's, across a person's lifespan, and looks at the different progress that they make in that period of time. And it all, to me, comes back down to the schooling system as a whole. We look at individuals as from a holistic point of view. We need to look at a school from a holistic point of view. And I think the branding that I see quite often is when schools represent themselves as developing the leaders of tomorrow, or, the experts of tomorrow, or the future something is always in the title, and it always comes back down to whose responsibility is that. It shouldn't just be the career advisor's responsibility to support that progress of a student. They are merely one avenue. And so when we spoke earlier in the week, Liv, about what this really meant to me from a branding perspective, I've seen from a number of different Facebook sites that I'm on with teachers trying to work out how they're going to sell their subjects for students to opt in and pick their subjects up in year 11 and 12. I'm like, is that not a perfect opportunity to talk about the word opportunity in this particular subject area for life and work, which to me is what careers can be looked at in one aspect. From a branding angle, I think it's really important that everyone takes ownership, and careers education, people are really lucky in that respect because they get to solely focus on that particular area. But then you also need to be able to speak to other people in other particular subject areas and say, what role can we play collectively to help make the biggest impact? And Sam, I'll certainly 100% agree with you. It comes back down to awareness and understanding and respect for teachers and each other, and what role we play in collectively contributing to changing the perception or the mindset of students as well as staff as well. So a cultural change certainly needs to happen. And Liv, you specifically asked me to address my PhD research. I'm particularly looking at a soft skills analysis, and I think the challenge that I find is that there is no piece of assessment that, teachers give out on a formal report where you're actually talking about the skills that students will need when they do start choosing a career and how transferable those skills are. So what can we do as educators to change that perception and change the language and assessment around skills, and actually start educating parents and educating industry on supporting the skills that young people have and how to better equip them for when they do progress in life and work, whether it be through education, whether it be through going straight into an organisation, or whether they want to start their own company or create something of their own. It's all about how do we create value, and what is it that we want our young people to look for. If so, then what responsibility are we taking to actually contribute to them becoming good leaders, or them becoming really skilled as problem solvers? We need to be supporting that with evidence. And I think careers is a really awesome space and awesome opportunity to be able to really address those skills and work with industry partners at a really unique level to be able to say, let's do something. This is where it can start, but the conversation has to exist in every single subject area. I might get 1 hour or I might get 2 hours. How can I elevate what you're doing in your lessons and support what you teach? I work with a number of different subject area teachers, and they're all struggling with the same thing. How do I get experts in the room? The career advisor is the biggest part and support team that any teacher in the classroom can have, because they are the conduit between industry and the school. And I have refused to work with any school unless I work with a career advisor, and I most importantly need to have support from the principal. So I highly value the careers team, and I know there's very, very little time allocated and very little support allocated in that space, but there are so many organisations out there who need career advisors to understand the language of connecting to industry. And hopefully I've answered those questions. I won't take up too much of your time.
No, that's fantastic. I think the even as simple as looking at, you know, what's in that single paragraph on a school's website, and it is often like 21st century skills, lifelong learning. I'm just like, well, who's doing that? Is it embedded throughout? We're going to create a world of opportunities, and it probably often doesn't. There's a disconnect between how much we focus on that and how embedded it is throughout the subjects. Versus how much we say. And there's a couple of things coming in about, which I knew it would as soon as we mentioned soft skills in terms of language. And I think, you know, soft skills is a very contentious issue. It's been kind of used, it's one of those ones that's easy to say because people know what you're talking about. But I think there is a huge push to move from calling it soft skills to what do you move to?
Well, I don't think we should go down that rabbit hole.
I agree. Soft skills has the perception that they're soft and not essential, but yeah, I think we can come back to that one. We'll park that as a language thing that we should address at some point. And then thanks for that, Liz. I think that's really valuable, and it's really good to see how you're addressing it from okay, how do you address a whole school strategy to get that balance right and get everybody that whole school approach to that issue, and the measurement piece as well, which also came up in previous sessions. Pat, you've been in the current role, Pathways and Partnerships for Sydney Catholic Schools since, is it just this year, since January 2020, is that right?
That's right, Liv.
So can you tell us a bit about your role and your three hats and what's your focus and whether you've come across this issue?
Thanks, Liv, and good afternoon, evening to all. Yeah, as Liv said, I have arrived in this role just this year. I was invited by our Executive Director of Schools to take this on, and we hadn't had someone in this role previously. So the focus of the work to date has been some emerging work within our system where we're developing networks of schools, primary, secondary, early childhood, and working with people giving leadership to those networks to really ask the question of, well, if your network is connecting schools but also connecting with tertiary education, business, industry, other agencies, how can I play a role in relation to that? It's also looking at the way in which young people make their way from K to 12 within school. And a particular piece of work that a group of us are focused on at the moment is the general capabilities and trying to bring those into sharper focus and more to life. And I'll come back to that in a little while. The other two hats I bring today are 10 years of principalship at Southern Cross Catholic Vocational College prior to being in this role, and in particular working in the vet space. There's a real challenge in both students and parents' perceptions, particularly parents, that vet in significant quarters doesn't enjoy the same parity of esteem as university or other pathways. So there's challenges there in relation to that. And my third hat for the current moment at least is being part of a panel of review looking at senior secondary pathways that's being chaired by Peter Sheargold. And we're presenting a report to Dan Tehan, the Education Minister, in the next week or two. So that's been a great privilege to have been a part of that panel and wander around the countryside and see what's happening in different jurisdictions and listening in particular to young people as well as some not so young people.
And from all of that work together and moving into a role that focuses on that, have you seen that there's an image problem a bit beyond the vets specifically within it, but as a field generally?
Sure. Look, picking up a little on Sam and Liz, I think there are a number of challenges. I think the terminology of careers education within that I've heard the terms careers advice and careers guidance and careers counselling, and they can sometimes be used interchangeably, and they don't mean the same thing, but sometimes they conflate. The role of the careers person in a school, is that primarily with students? Does it also have a role with colleagues? Does it also have a role with parents and carers? And I'd put the case to say, yes, it needs to be all of those in different nuanced ways. There's an inconsistency around the time and resources given to people in those roles. Sam, by the sounds of things, is very fortunate, but that's not universally the case. I would put the case, and I know Liv, in your work and others, that careers education, or whatever we're going to call it in relation to careers, must be primary and secondary, and yet the default position is secondary. And I think one of the unifying threads in relation to that can be the general capabilities when they are taken up and taken on in a meaningful way. A couple of thoughts at the outset, or other thoughts, I should say. I'm more and more of the view that careers are no longer linear, if they ever were, and learning is lifelong but not linear. So, you know, whether we look at Foundations for Young Australians, whether we look at Hugh Mackay, whether we look at other researchers, clearly young people are going to leave school with a set of schools and with various certification. I'd argue it's their skills that will open the first door, and it's the deepening and extending and further development of those skills that will open other doors. If they're going to be working in 7 different careers in their paid work life, 18 different, take those stats with a grain of salt, but recognise that within that there's a significant truth, I believe. The final point is really around access to data and access to the labour market that can inform the conversations which need to take place. I mentioned prior to starting today that one of the presentations to the review panel was from a couple of New South Wales Department officials who have been involved in a piece of work bringing together data for 16 to 24-year-olds from 1996 to 2016. There's 3.5 million in this data set. It's currently sitting on a ministerial desk. How good would it be if that eventually sees the light of day to inform policy, to inform practice, to highlight the experience of 20 years worth of young people transitioning out of school, to debunk some thoughts and to open up other possibilities.
Yeah, that would be just gold. And is there qualitative research in there as well, or is it actual pathways?
My understanding is that it's a bit of both, and it's drawn on both Commonwealth and state data, and a significant part of bringing it all together was getting the various individual parts of government machinery to talk to each other and release data and de-identify and work through confidentiality, but they've made it.
Wow, I can't wait I hope that does see the light of day. I think, what that is absolutely, I think, what we're missing at a general level, at a school level. And, we keep talking about the only data we really have is the demand side data, not the supply side. Like, we need to start there. And just coming back to your point about the general capabilities, do you think that, we've got the general capabilities there? I would argue that careers and adaptability skills aren't in there explicitly enough. If we're talking about actually pulling out this, preparing for a lifetime of learning and course adjustments, then it should be more explicit.
Look, I absolutely don't disagree. I suppose I go back to the dugout and even before first base and wonder out loud. I think in some jurisdictions, general capabilities are taken seriously and are addressed. In other parts of the country and in other schools, they are lip service.
Yeah. I think that's a whole other other bag, isn't it, related? Jim, I know you'll be desperate to jump in on the careers side of things and the evidence base before we jump into our breakout rooms.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to hear Pat say careers are not linear.
Yeah.
Music to my ears. And you mentioned Hugh Mackay and the foundation. You've got somebody in the room who's been saying that for 20 years and been publishing research on that for 20 years. Unfortunately, we have to still keep saying it, because although maybe 5 or 10 years ago, we started to see people suddenly increasingly use the language of non-linearity and complexity, and they started to use that in relation to careers. It was a bit of a false dawn that people would make the statement that careers are complex, they're subject to multiple influences, we need lifelong learning, it's non-linear. But then what? And it didn't kind of go further than the South Australian government had it in their policy. The New South Wales work studies unit, the curriculum people put together, talked about it a lot, but implementing that has been an issue. So acknowledging it is one thing, but doing something is another. So it's great to hear that, because it really is critical. I mean, only this morning I find myself correcting the graduate careers people in Britain on Twitter, who were saying because of COVID, we've had to move our workshops from preparing people to get jobs to changing their career plans. This is new. And I said, this is not new. This is core work that we've been doing in this field for, since the very beginning. So there's still a big job to be done there, which we mustn't underestimate. I thought there's so many good points that everyone has made. Sam talked briefly about legacy perceptions, and I do think this is a real issue, particularly for those of us working in the education field and in high schools or primary schools. You're up against all the time the perceptions of parents and their own experiences of going through school. It's not only in careers, obviously, it's in teaching mathematics or English or anything, but certainly that dreaded experience that they had with the careers advisor in 1426 colours their feeling about the whole field. So we're always battling people who are one generation or two generations behind where the field likes to think it is. There's also an issue of regeneration of careers advisors themselves, dare I say it. So we're battling the fact that we have colleagues in the field who are 5 or 6 or 10 generations behind where the field is, because of a lack of a culture of ongoing professional development, which has only recently become into the field, which becomes an issue. I'm going to be a bit sort of contentious here and say I think there is a big image problem, and I think that careers in the career department is seen as the centre link of schools. It's the place that the unfortunate people go to. So if you're on your path, you know where you want to go, you've got ambition, you've got skills, you've got good insight, well, you don't bother with the career service. You don't need that. So it's still got this sense of being a remedial service for those who perhaps have lost their way. I'm not saying this is true at all, but I do believe that perception is abroad. And it's interesting, isn't it, that suddenly vast swathes of the Australian working population have had to make contact with Centrelink because of COVID. People have asked, will it change their perceptions of Centrelink and people who need their services? And I do wonder somewhat in careers whether this is the case, that people, it's still seen a bit as sort of Gumnut Cottage, where you send people who've got special needs. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed, because what we've missed in this field, because that leads, I suppose, to counselling. What we've missed in this field is the revolution of coaching. And the late, great friend of mine, Tony Grant at Sydney University, had a tremendously successful coaching master's program for years. And of course, his big shtick was coaching is all about performance improvement and enhancement. It's not about remediation. Whereas, we only changed the name of one of our professional groups from the Association of Career Counsellors to the Association of Career Development, maybe only 10 years ago. So we've been a bit kind of slow on that approach. So there's a whole issue of counselling versus coaching and development. Do we need to be, I think most of us in this webinar would argue that we're all about adding value and enhancing people, and to use some of the marketing terms, getting them ahead of the curve, getting them to maximize their talents. Patrick's point about lifelong learning, we're not setting them up for the first transition, we're setting them up to be able to do this throughout life. You know, there's a lot of exciting things that we're doing there, which is all very proactive, and it's all about performance enhancement. It's not about sort of dealing with the stragglers who lost their way and sort of push them off into the satanic mills. And I think that's, I think that we've got a Centrelink problem. I think this it's interesting, this idea about it's a spread responsibility, and I really take Liz's point about the leaders of tomorrow who should be doing this, and it needs to be in every subject area. And there's been this constant refrain, but there's a real tension in schools about putting it into every subject area. And because do you really want to trust careers information to teachers who are already massively burdened with what they're trying to do to maintain the curriculum, who may also be very conflicted about their own careers, which may have stalled, or they may have gone into teaching for reasons which are not necessarily as high and laudable as we would prefer, because it might be something like they could get away to pick up kids from school themselves or something. Are they the right people to be conveying this valuable information or not? Now, I know we must trust our colleagues and respect them, but there's a challenge there about how we go about doing that. And certainly just rolling stuff out and saying, here, you know, here's some career stuff for maths or what have you, doesn't seem to have been successful. The DET had some brilliant curriculum guides about 15 years ago for every area of the curriculum, showing with examples and lesson plans, and the whole thing didn't seem to work. It didn't seem to get any take up for some reasons. I don't know why. But I think that's an interesting challenge there too. I think there's something else that we've got to get over. And I said this in a keynote in 2008 and wrote it in a paper called the First 11 Shifts that we need to make. And that is, we need to get away from this idea that our primary purpose is information provision. And we've got to move from informing to informing and transforming. And we've got to put much more emphasis on the transformational aspects of what we do. If we think we're in the information business, we're out of business, because the internet has done that. We can no longer be the wise owl with lots of career books behind us on the shelf and thumb through it to tell people sort of, you know, what's involved in being a particular role. That stuff that's all passed us by. So we should not see ourselves as primarily informers. Yet at policy level, time and time again, the programs that get rolled out by governments, presumably informed by people like ourselves talking to them, is they need better information. They'll make better decisions if they're better informed. Well, actually, I don't agree, because it's actually the process of decision making and understanding that which is critically important, not simply the product of, and it's not simply they're making bad decisions or less than optimal decisions because the information's poor. And that's something politicians still don't get, because, of course, the solution for politicians is information's cheap. It's very easy to just chuck more stuff at people. It's much more expensive to do transformational work. Yeah, I think, and finally, we've got a definitional problem for the field, because we've got a definitional problem that we've uncritically accepted this silly definition about what career development is, which it has various flavors, but it goes along the lines of the sum paid of the total of the paid and unpaid roles one assumes throughout life. Now, if you've heard that, or variants of that definition, my challenge to you is to think of any activity in life which is not captured by that definition. So the definition essentially means that we're about life, and it's so broad it's meaningless, and it's also dangerous professionally, because it gives us license to poke around in all kinds of areas of life for which we are not formally trained and shouldn't be doing it. And it confuses the public and the punters, because they don't know what it is that we do, whereas they have a clear idea that a yoga teacher is not a chiropractor, is not an orthopedic surgeon. People have there are boundary limitations, and in our excitement to get all holistic and all inclusive, we've just defined ourselves out of existence. And this definition sits in major government policies put together by people in our field, and it's been sitting there for 20 years, and I think it's really problematic. I reckon that paid employment, paid work at some level has to be included, because ultimately that is what most of us are talking about most of the time. And sure, there are periods of people not having paid employment through unemployment, through voluntary work, through maternity leave and so forth. Sure, but it's only when it's contrasted to the concept of paid work that it is important for us. There's lots of interesting issues around maternity leave, which have nothing to do with us. They're to do with psychological issues, they're to do with sociological issues, they're to do with a whole bunch of other stuff, but they're not to do with career issues per se. So we need to be a bit careful about trying to take on the whole world here, because otherwise we become meaningless. Okay, end of rant.
Okay. No, I agree. I think that, we've talked in previous sessions about, life design is great because ultimately people are fitting themselves together with the world of work in a context of their broader life. But it's where do you draw those boundaries to actually have a focus and prove the value of this role? That's a lot of food for thought, and the comments and chat are going crazy. So I'm going to create these breakout rooms now. We're going to create 3 rooms, and Liz, Sam, and Pat will be facilitating them. Might take a few minutes, a few seconds, hopefully, rather than minutes, to move everyone around. Will be 15 minutes, and then we will. How do I move people through here? I'm going to find the right people to move. Okay. Okay, we're good. Right. There are.
It's just us two. Right.
Oh, hold on. No, we've got 2 people not in a room. Hold on. How do I add to a room? And Mills, move to. And. So you can jump into a room. Can you see those breakout rooms?
No, I've got something that says breakout rooms.
You open that.
The host is inviting me to join breakout room 2, it says here. Is that? I'll say later to that.
You can say, you should be able to see and just join a room. So
I've got the group chat up. I can just see you, me, and Dan.
yeah, Dan is supposed to be in room 3, but he might be busy doing something.
I've got the thing at the bottom that says breakout rooms. If I click on that.
Yeah, if you click on that, you should be able to join any room. So
look, you've assigned me to room 2. I think you've assigned me incorrectly.
Yes, you've ended up in.
That's why that happened. So while those people in those rooms, presumably they can't hear this conversation we're having. Dan can, presumably, but no one else can.
Yeah.
I see.
So why don't you jump into, shall I put you in room 3 for a minute?
Well, why don't you just let me choose and then I can.
I don't know how you do that.
Oh, it's in breakout rooms.
It's basically put everybody apart from me into a room.
Well, because that's your status. Can I have the same status as you, or is that not allowed?
I don't think so. I think you can only have one host. But I think you can probably come out of the room when you want. It's not like you're going to get locked in.
Yeah. Okay. Who's in which rooms? Tell me the.
Right. So Liz is in that one, or 3 is Pat.
3's Pat, and so
Sam is 1.
Sam is 1, Liz is 2, and Pat is 3. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And you think I should go to sit into Liz?
I think it would be good to go to 2.
All right. Okay.
If you're happy with that for a minute, because.
Sure.
Yeah.
it's so varied across, you know, states, institutions, and I think one of the part of the perception problems is that I think it depends on who you asked what career education is really about. So if you looked at different stakeholders within your school organisation, they may be different things. And I know with a lot of my other colleagues across other schools is they'll sometimes have that satisfaction survey, and the students will often rate the services really high, and then the parents may not rate it as high as what the students is. So it's coming in from that different perception and understanding, and it also links back to that awareness. So I think there's a bit of a I think there is definitely, you know, variation in different stakeholders within organisations, and you know, you only have to look at the varied allocation across the board. With even, I mean, particularly Rowena, I'm not too sure what's it like within your setting. Do you guys have formalised lessons? What's it like there? Sorry to throw you on the spot.
That's okay. I'm relatively new. I've only been doing this for 18 months. I'm at Presbyterian Ladies College in Sydney. And I'm taking over from somebody who's been doing the careers at PLC for about 20 years. And I'm at that stage of wanting to reinvent it, to do something fresh and new. So we don't have formalized lessons. We did many, many years ago, but apparently it wasn't successful. So that was taken off the curriculum, off the program. A lot of what we do is just talking one-to-one with students. We have a few sort of year group presentations, but we don't have anything that's formalized. It's not a central thing in the school. It hasn't been a central thing at the school. I think it's been one of those adjunct things that is good to have. So I think part of my role is to try and make it more central, and to make it more, you know, as we've just been discussing in the last half hour, is to actually bring it to the fore more than it has been. I think you mentioned about allocation. At the moment, we've got about a 1.1 allocation between me and the other person, but that's probably going to change next year to be less. So we've got a school from K to 12 of about 1,300. Really, we formally only do anything from 10 to 12. I've started working with year 8s and 9s, but it's a slow process. Yeah.
And it's really interesting too, because we focus at that top end where we know we can actually have the most impact down the bottom, where we really challenge those perceptions, particularly key transition point. But we look at across the board, across the state, across the country, and that top end is always the focus, and it always, you know, I think that's something that we've really got to shake up, and it's really hard. It's not an easy thing to do, because it takes time and it's changing
roles. And you know, I'm the vet coordinator. I do work experience. I'm a careers counsellor. I do newsletters. I contribute to planning of curriculum and you know, handbooks, and you know, I write documents all the time. So there's so many roundabout things, and I do that in one school 2.5 days a week. I'm not sure how I survive it. So there's respect amongst some for the role, for the general role, but it's very hard to get that foot in the door with curriculum. I'll just be quiet so someone else can say something.
Right. Other pearls of wisdom?
I think, as Jim said, that it's still very much set in what it was in the 1980s. It's work experience, it's year 10 and then year 12 subject selection. And it feels like careers is not contemporary. I've worked as a careers practitioner in a school, and also more recently with elite athletes and within industry for workforce development. And it just still feels that the careers is the same as what it was for me 30 years ago. And also probably a lot of it is to do with a lack of support from the schools as well. So that really the careers role and careers as is a subject as important for as maths and English and other subjects within a school, and it's never perceived like that from parents because it's not treated like that by the school.
Nor is it treated by the VCAA or whatever organisation we have. Curriculum authorities don't take it very seriously.
Mm.
And I also find it interesting that we've actually introduced like the work study classes this year. Last year was the first year at year 9 and 10, and I feel that the teachers teaching those classes feel really inadequate, don't understand what the goals are of the class, and there's a lot of mentoring and hand-holding that needs to happen at that level. And what I find interesting is that that this is not being taught where in universities where teachers are being educated about education and incorporating careers education as part of that as well.
Good point.
Because I feel like they really feel inadequate and don't want to teach it because they just don't know enough about it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else who hasn't shared today?
I guess I'm lucky. My last two schools, they've both valued my work and they've let me create, sort of do what I want to do, like go in directions that perhaps initially they weren't sure about, but they supported every initiative and idea that I came up with. So I guess it just depends on, I don't know what it depends on, your enthusiasm, I guess, for, and I know everyone's enthusiastic, but working with your principal and deputies and about sort of trying to persuade them to see your point of view in various programs. So I guess there's a willingness. A lot of both my last two principals really value careers advisors. So maybe there is a change. When they haven't had one for a while and then they get one, they really value it. That's in New South Wales. I don't know what it's like in Victoria.
I think there's a big divide between school systems too, that there tends to be a full-time person in most independent schools, and the higher the fees, the more of a career.
Let's everyone have a little bit, and then, as James mentioned, we'll do a bit of a discussion point around some of those particular points that you highlighted, particularly about being stuck in the dark corner. Jeffrey, what's it like for you, Jeffrey?
Classroom time has been given to careers education only in 2014. It's 4 hours a year for grade, I think it's from grade 5 to grade 12. And for post-secondary, it's about 20 hours a year. I think the main focus is really to prepare students to transit at key stages of their education journey, for example, in grade 6, in grade 9, and in grade 12. So a lot of it has to do with helping students to gain an awareness of their strength and to plan their pathways forward. The other aspect of careers education is understanding
from that individual model to more of that group-based, sort of, and that comes down to empowering as well. So rather, and I see that, particularly happening in a tertiary setting now, there's less and less opportunity of working in that one-on-one capacity, but it's more working in that group and that community, and it's bringing those connections in. So maybe the structure of the delivery maybe perhaps needs to change, and I don't know, I'm just thinking of these ideas out loud. Well, I think we're going to get thrown back into the
Yeah, I agree, Sam. And I think as well,
We were having a great chat, you know.
I know, I was spying. Everyone was at really good different points, but I see time ticking along. It's a big subject, we need longer to cover it. You're big on my screen, Sam. You were the first one back. What are the key takeaways from your group? What were the biggest challenges? Like, is there an issue or not? And what would the focus be?
Sorry, that was me.
Yep.
So I think as a group, and please my group jump in if I'm talking out of turn here, is we thought that a bit of inconsistency across different stakeholders within the organisation, their perceptions, they may have different perceptions based on it is. We also, and this is sort of steering off a little bit different, but we said rather than going too big is just start with those small ripple effects, those changes that you can make. They don't necessarily need to be at the individual level, but they can actually you know, flow out. I'm hoping other people from my room are going to jump in now and sit here as well.
So the things that we are doing right now, make them visible.
Make them visible, absolutely, and don't be afraid. I think we also sometimes can be a little bit critical on ourselves and thinking that we have to fix everything now and we have to do everything, and it can be quite overwhelming. But I think if you're very deliberate in what you're doing and having even those small little impacts, there will be ripple effects from that, and then that's absolutely okay. But it's that you're in that there for the long-term game, not that fast, quick win.
And was there a general, what was the perception of careers education? Was there you said it's inconsistent. Was the perception of people felt how they were perceived in their role and their function, was that an issue?
We sort of we kind of got to that point, but we actually spent a lot of time talking about Jim's point that he made earlier along with the change of being from informing to transforming. And we thought that maybe perhaps having that last link would be empowering, linked in with that change and that shift. So we kind of got a little bit sidetracked.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, that's good, because I guess it's more meaningful to start there than talk about, you know, careers education as a word. It's much better to change what we do than change what we say.
It's the process, the process and how it's delivered and how we can actually have the most impact, because we were saying as a group that we can actually have the most impact down in those younger years, but we always tend to still focus up the top. And why is that? And why are we doing things the way that we are? So
you know my view.
Yes, no, I know.
I won't get into that. Pat, what were the key takeaways from your group? Is there an issue?
Absolutely, and I think to some of Sam's observations, they certainly rattled around in our small group conversation. The three things that we landed on at the end of our conversation, one was, to Sam's point and Jim's earlier point, that whole sense of what happens in the careers education experience with staff and students in particular, that whole informing and transforming. A challenge around buy-in from students, buy-in from parents, buy-in from leaders, systems and curriculum. And again, to points that have already been made in relation to perception, and the inconsistency from one system to another, inconsistency from one state and jurisdiction to another. Massive challenges there.
Okay, so when you talk about experience, it's actually what the perception of what that experience is needs to shift. Yeah,
and the experience, even from a resourcing perspective, that it's a mandatory part of department schools in New South Wales. It's not in Catholic schools. It's not in independent schools. So there's not even a baseline from which we can proceed.
No. Yeah, there's a lot of work to do, which at one level, but then I think on Sam's point, if we know that there are people working at that bigger policy level and strategy level, which hopefully your work is leading into, Pat, then what we can do day to day is make that as valuable.
I cannot confirm nor deny, but remain optimistic.
Oh, good. Yes, always optimistic. And Liz, you're not on my screen here. What was the big takeaways from your group?
Our group, we specifically focused on the first discussion point, which looked at what did career education look like. And we were very lucky to have Jeffrey, who spoke about the work in Singapore that's been done around, you know, the amount of time careers advisors have. And we had 4 hours for juniors and 20 hours for seniors. And you think of the role of a career advisor having to look after every student in the year group. It seems really unfair to be able to help a young person decide their career path having very, very minimal time with the student.
So the actual allocation in Singapore is so much better.
I still laugh at that point, going so much better. I sit here and I think, what is good enough with regards to that? And James, did you have anything else you wanted to add from our group?
Oh, let me unmute you.
Outlining the sort of business of what we're doing in terms of pathway planning, understanding strengths, world of work, and lifelong skills. We also got into, Matt was talking about how do we leverage this with our colleagues? You know, that's the point I alluded to at the beginning. How do you get other staff on board? Everyone seems to think it's a good idea that this should be across the school. Incidentally, I wonder whether it should be across the school, because is maths across the school? Is English across the school? Should they be? Don't know. It's an interesting point. But if we agree it is a good idea to get them across the school, how do we get these teachers on board to do it when they may not be rewarded for doing it? You know, their performance rewards might be related to academic achievement rather than this careers.
Unless we can prove that link between being more engaged academically.
Yeah, so that was, and I think there's also interesting point made about that again, and it goes back to what Patrick was talking about, that there's these inconsistencies across different educational settings, but in some systems, the career stuff is really outside of everything else. It's outside of the curriculum area. It's sitting out there like, you know, as a satellite kind of thing. Is that, are there advantages to that? Are there disadvantages? Does that need changing? So that there's a few things, but I think probably like all of the rooms that we were just warming up when Liv came along and switched the lights off and said, go to bed.
Well, I think we need to come back to this one and go deeper on what we can do from here. I'm kind of encouraged that you know, we had the kind of philosophical debate about careers and the language and the soft skills language, but nobody's really getting hung up on that as the deal breaker, as the challenge. It's much more about how do we prove the value and how do we increase the understanding and the visibility of what's possible. And I think going back to that yoga analogy, if we look at what the catalysts for change were, it was people more understanding the evidence of benefits, the experience being more consistent and nicer. So you'd expect a yoga studio, you had better clothes to wear, and it was visibility of the value. So, you know, for yoga and active wear, it was all about Instagram and influencers. But it's absolutely the same as this ripple effect. We can take those little stories and make them visible, which will, you know, where we're doing pockets of brilliance, can we do that? And that's something I've really valued from this group, is that sharing of ideas. So yeah, thank you so much. I think I'm going to post the link to the next session, which I think is going to actually be a follow on from this, which it has to be because we've got so much more to talk about. Feel free to stick around, unmute yourself, and we'll have a chat and keep talking. It is a huge issue. I think we've confirmed that yes, there's a brand issue or an image problem, and we haven't quite worked out how we're going to solve it. But I think there's enough ideas and angles we can go at in terms of evidence, value, and telling those stories and visibility of it, that we can actually build some plans even within this group for what we do. So thank you everyone for coming. Actually, the next session, because everyone's gone back to school full time, we are planning to push these to fortnightly, if that works for everyone. So the next session, the link is just there, and yeah, so it's 2 weeks tonight.